Well, better line of work, make it better too, probably.
It's in our budget. The staff goes out once a
He's
year.
lost some weight.
Show it
Give
again.
him credit for that.
We show it in our
That's when you start to lose weight.
Budget.
Just sweat it off.
salaries. Very expensive. We don't project it.
Well, welcome to the Wilson Center and to this discussion of a very interesting new book. My name is Catherine Weathersby. I'm the Senior Associate of the History and Public Policy program here at the Center. And I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker, Michael Kurtz, who is currently the Assistant Archivist for Records Services here in Washington. He has responsibility for all records management, archival, and public outreach program functions performed by the National Archives and Records Administration. He's also an adjunct professor at the University of Maryland's College of Information Studies. He teaches a course on the management of cultural institutions. Dr. Kurtz has published extensively in the areas of archival management and American history. Some of his works include Managing Archival and Manuscript Repositories, published in 2004, and Nazi Contraband, American Policy on the Return of European Cultural Treasures, 1945 to 55, published in 1985. He served as chair of the Archives Management Roundtable of the Society of American Archivists from 1987 to 2001. So you can see from this brief bio that he's eminently qualified to examine the subject of his recently published book, America and the Return of Nazi Contraband, The Recovery of Europe's Cultural Treasures, published by Cambridge University Press. I commend it to all of you, and I'm glad that you are here. Many other people will be listening to our discussion via the webcast, so I wanted to point that out too. This will be a live webcast. In this book, Dr. Kurtz examines a question, the question of restitution of art, archives, and libraries that had been seized by the Nazis during their time in power. It's a terribly complicated story and really terribly interesting. He wrote about it initially, as he told me, in his dissertation, completed in 1985, and thought that that was kind of the end of the story, right? The Americans had ended up being responsible for dealing with this question because so much of it was in the American occupation zone. But by 1985, it seemed that the issue had pretty much been laid to rest. However, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the East European communist countries, the end of the Cold War in 1991, had the result of bringing again to the surface the question of restitution of cultural properties seized by the Nazis, because places that formerly had not been accessible to restitution authorities, and for other reasons as well, I will let Dr. Kurtz explain, those were now accessible. Also, the end of the Cold War brought about the issue in general of the restitution of property that communist governments had seized from individuals and institutions during the course of the communist period. This got mingled in with the question of Nazi property. And so what was already a complicated issue perhaps became even more complicated, and it continues to be important today and important for the United States, as we have played the leading role in dealing with this issue. So I'm very pleased to turn the floor over to Michael Kurtz. We will then have an opportunity for questions when he finishes speaking. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Good afternoon to everyone. I'm very pleased to be here at the Wilson Center and appreciate the opportunity to talk about this very, very interesting subject, and it is. What I'd like to do is give you a little bit of background on really how I came to the topic, because I think that's kind of interesting, and to give kind of an overview as best I can of the period from the 1940s to the present and what happened with looting and restitution, how it really was really interwoven into the American government's military and political strategies throughout World War II, the interest of Franklin Roosevelt, and some of the surprising turn of events. And as Catherine said, I really did think it was a story pretty much told and completed and ended as of the mid-'80s. Not much had happened really in the area of restitution from the mid-'50s to the early '60s. And so it seemed to be pretty much settled. And then there were these extraordinarily dramatic changes in the Soviet Union, information about what actually the Soviets stole back and forth from the Germans, and we began to find out more about where a lot of material really was. And there was a tremendous movement in this country and around the world in the mid-1990s that really resurrected this issue in a most dramatic way. So it seemed to me it made sense, so much had happened since I finished the first book, to write another one. And I ended up really rewriting the whole thing because it took on kind of a different perspective with more information available. But I got introduced to the topic. I work at the National Archives. I have for many decades. And I was a student at Georgetown looking for a dissertation topic. So my advisor said, well, you work at the archives, you have the records of the American military government there in their voluminous glory, and there are topics in that. Talked to two of my colleagues, and one said, well, you could always do information control in occupied Germany. And I thought, no, I don't think so. And then I was talking to a gentleman who's unfortunately passed away some years ago, John Mendelsohn, who was a refugee from Germany. And he said, have you ever heard of cultural restitution? And I said, no, what is that? And he said, well, it's the whole way in which we handled looted art in archives and libraries and how they were returned. I said, that sounds fascinating. And it really has proven to be fascinating. It's a story that has many complex origins, but I think where it really begins from the American perspective is the great anxiety in the art world and the library world in particular in the late 1930s, early 40s as World War II really began and the vast destructiveness of it began to become apparent. It was concerned, first of all, about the protection of monuments and historical buildings and collections during wartime. And there had been some efforts in the interwar period. And of course, there was the Geneva Conventions of 1899 and 1906 that dealt with rules of conduct for warfare and put some parameters on pillaging and looting and tried to put some structure. There had been a great deal of looting by the Germans in the course of World War I, which had been caused tremendous bitterness, particularly in Belgium and France. And in the Versailles Treaty, at the end of World War I, there were several provisions in it that required restitution from Germany to Belgium and France, particularly Belgium. And these were controversial provisions for the Germans because one of them related to the Van Eyck altarpiece from Belgium and required not only the return of what had been taken by the Germans in the course of the war, but also required that other panels of this altar that had been bought over the course of the 19th century, legitimately by Germans, be returned as compensation. You might say restitution in kind was the concept. So amongst the many much of the bitterness of the Germans after World War I about the Versailles Treaty, this was part of it. And the League of Nations had tried to develop a convention for the protection of historical materials and historical sites in the late 1930s as the situation moved towards war. This got basically very little international support. So what was in place from the point of view of international law at the outbreak of World War II were the Geneva Conventions of some decades before. And clearly the German attack on Poland and everything that followed thereafter indicated this was going to be a massive problem. And so a small group of museum directors, art museum directors, were really kind of the dominant group that pushed in this country for some kind of involvement by the United States, active involvement, particularly as we moved into the war as an active participant, to deal with the protection. The initial emphasis was protection of these materials. And so you have the senior members of the National Gallery of Art, the Fogg Museum in Harvard, and so forth, as the kind of the folks that really got this rolling as far as trying to really get attention to the issue. And they found a supporter in Franklin Roosevelt. And Roosevelt was interested in the topic in general, but actually he was also particularly interested about records and the protection of records. And a refugee, an archivist from Germany who had come to the United States in the 30s, Ernst Postner, wrote a paper presented a paper on the use of records during periods of occupation. And remember, this is very early in the war, and he sent a copy of this to Roosevelt, who was taken with this idea and so forth. And you might know Franklin Roosevelt is the creator of the Presidential Library System, which is part of the National Archives, and he actually created his library in 1941. So he had an interest in history and archives, records, cultural preservation. And so these folks who were very interested, these cultural leaders, you might say, in this issue, wrote a letter to Roosevelt in 1942 saying the government needs to, the army, the military needs to organize a unit that is going to put out policies and so forth to protect these cultural objects. As it became clear, obviously we were going to have to retake Europe, and there were going to be tremendous battles over grounds filled with historical monuments and archives and libraries and museums. Also, at the same time, it had been clear, from the mid-30s onward, that there was a great deal of expropriation of Jewish property by the Nazis in Austria and Germany, and obviously in the rest of Europe as they conquered it. So there was a great deal of interest in the American Jewish community on this issue of what would become of Jewish cultural and religious property that had been seized by the Nazis. So, from 1935 onward, you find a decided interest and concern in this topic, in addition to the overall concern of what was happening to Jews in Germany and Austria in general. There was also this particular focus was part of that. So you have kind of coming from two different perspectives concern about this issue. By 1942 and 1943, it was becoming clear about, at least to the higher levels of the American government, about the parameters of the Holocaust and what was occurring in the destruction of European Jewry. And so there was just a tremendous amount of focus and interest in this. And so Roosevelt established what was called the Roberts Commission. It was named for the chairman, who was a Supreme Court Justice, Owen Roberts. And it had a much longer formal name, but it's always been known as the Roberts Commission. And it was tasked with developing policies and recommending policies to the U.S. government for the protection and the return. This is where you start to see restitution starts to come into the dialogue. The return of what the Nazis stole. And in 1943, in January, the Allies, as a collectivity, put out what was called the London Declaration, which said anything that had been seized, stolen, or ostensibly bought by the Nazis, these transactions, would be considered null and void, and the property would be returned, whether we're talking about cultural or non-cultural. And so then the U.S. Army created a unit called the Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives Unit, which were mostly officers, some enlisted men, who were in civilian life, museum curators and museum directors and architects and people with that sort of background, to serve in these units, to be with the military as they invaded first Sicily and then Italy and then Normandy, to be with the units and to try to protect these historic sites from the ravages of battle, And these were always, at most, perhaps in the military, at its peak, you would have maybe 30, 35 people in this. So I want to, kind of give you the feeling that this was not a massive effort on the military side or the federal government side, but it was an effort. And these folks were kind of tagging along with the 7th Army and the 5th Army and so on and so forth, trying to do their task and getting support from the Civil Affairs Division in the War Department and from the Roberts Commission, which basically functioned out of the National Gallery of Art. That's where they got their staff support. And so as the battle is going across Europe and ending up in Germany, in occupied Germany, by happenstance, really, the bulk of what the Nazis hid as they were being attacked and bombed and so on and so forth ended up in what became the U.S. zone of occupation. It wasn't certainly planned that way or expected to be that way, but we ended up with about 15 million items that were uncovered from a variety of hiding places. Salt mines was a favorite, where the Nazis would hide, works of art and so forth. Monasteries, castles, a variety of places. Where the Nazi looting organization, the ERR, the Rosenberg looting organization, which was really one of several, and a book I would recommend is a book by Jonathan Petropoulos that came out a few years back called Art as Politics in the Third Reich, that really talks about kind of the whole upper Nazi competition amongst themselves for art and that sort of thing, and how there were actually multiple looting organizations in the whole Nazi arena competing with one another and so forth. But the main one in Western Europe was the Rosenberg organization, which was really controlled by Goering in many ways, and through a variety of sordid relationships. But anyway, as the Nazis are pushed back, they're taking everything with them, and what they have in Germany, they try to hide during the bombing campaign and the attacks. And as I said, most of it ended up in the American zone of occupation. So General Clay was, for most of the occupation, the American military governor, Lucius Clay. And his basic attitude is, what do I do with this stuff? I mean, I've got people who are starving, I've got a shattered condition, I've got unrest, I've got all kinds of problems. And he never really wanted to be bothered with all of this art stuff and books and so forth, but he knew that he had an obligation. So they they ended up creating 3 major, what they call collecting points. One at Munich, primarily for art, Wiesbaden, which was the property that seemed to belong to Germans, that was German property, and then Offenbach, which was for the location for the archives and libraries that were uncovered, that were looted, and Jewish property, Jewish cultural property, all were in Offenbach. And so they kind of began to evolve this system. Then they would catalog the items, and we have, they had property cards for everything that was in the system, which is at the National Archives in College Park, where there's a tremendous amount of research that's gone on for many years. That's part of the Provenance Trail if you're trying to run down specific works of art. I did not focus so much on specific works of art except as illustrations of policy and politics. But so all right, there's all of this stuff, and they're in the process of beginning to preserve it and catalog it, but they want to return it. And one of the points I make in the book is, if you study restitution politics or diplomacy, you really see the whole dysfunctionality of the Allied relationship. Because like everything else that they tried to do, as a Big Three or a Big Four, it didn't work. And neither did restitution politics or diplomacy. They were never able to really work out an Allied-wide policy of what to do. The United States, which was kind of the most withdrawn in the sense that not directly involved in having its territory attacked or its property of its citizens looted, had perhaps, quote, a more objective point of view. The French, less so. because they had an axe to grind. The Russians, tremendous axe to grind about the Nazi destruction. And so when you're trying to work out issues such as restitution in kind, which was a very interesting concept, the idea behind it was, okay, you have this work of art or whatever, was stolen, it's either damaged, destroyed, can't be returned, and so what the idea is, then you would take a comparable piece or item from a German collection. And the French thought this was a great idea. The Russians did too, because everything in their zone they took. No, so regardless of what country it came from. And the United States and the British were not in favor of this, and really prolonged the debates and the discussions so that it never happened as far as formal policy goes. And they were concerned, the British and the Americans, that you would so alienate German public opinion if you start going into their collections and so forth to do this restitution in kind. But if you're on the other side of the fence where you've been attacked, invaded, plundered, you're not that sensitive to the sensitivities of the occupied nation, the Germans. So there was a lot of tension. The Russians would never provide information on what they found in their zone of occupation. The idea was each of the four powers would, provide to the others, what they found in their zone. They would have restitution missions from other nations coming in, which they certainly did in the British and the American zone, a dozen or more of them. The Russians would not participate in any activity of that nature or let anyone in to see what they were doing. So there was never any, and the French were always kind of on the fence, mixed feelings, mixed opinions, mixed attitudes. And so finally Clay decided, well, I've got to do something. I'm going to just start returning this stuff. And so he came up with a policy. There was a Monuments and Fine Arts policy unit that worked for him. And we'll have it 3 categories. Category A are the famous works that everybody knows who owns them. The Van Eyck altarpiece, the stained glass from the Strasbourg Cathedral, the Lion of Isted from Denmark, clear who owns them, and you return it to the country of origin. So all the restitution done by the United States, by and large, were to the countries of origin. Did not try to find out if there were private owners or anything of that nature. If it was Czech, it went back to Czechoslovakia. If it was French, it went back to France, and that's the level at which it was done. And category B was where we're not really sure. We'll return it, but if we find out we've made a mistake or something of that nature, we'll ask for it back. And category C were German property in the hands of the United States military government. And there a very interesting thing occurred. Right after the Potsdam Conference, the idea that I think Clay and Truman and others had was, since the United States would not be asking for monetary reparations from Germany, we would take some art. And so you had 202 works of art that were brought to the National Gallery in late 1945, early 1946. And this created an uproar in art circles in the United States. And this cadre of Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives officers wrote a protest to Clay, which, if you think about it, they're in uniform. And they're writing this letter of objection, which somehow finds its way to a journal, in the United States, as these things have a wont to do. And then even the Russians started to criticize, and the British didn't like this at all. That this is unseemly. And so the American military, the American government, came to the conclusion that this perhaps wasn't a good idea. That we were just taking these works of art temporarily for protection purposes, which was an unfortunate term because that's what the Nazis used as a term, protection purposes. And then so they stayed for a couple of years at the National Gallery. And then Senator Fulbright demanded that the American people get a chance to see these works of art. So they went on tour around the country in 1948, and the admission fees that were charged went to help German orphans, I believe. And eventually the works of art were returned to Germany. So that was kind of the only time we sort of flirted with the idea of art as reparations. And so we kind of moved out of that business pretty quickly and tried to systematize, brought in the restitution missions from the Netherlands and Belgium and so on and so forth, and identified and started to transport tons of material back to the countries of origin, including the Soviet Union. 500,000 items. The Soviet Union always maintained we never made any restitution to them. That is not accurate. We returned a great deal to the Soviet Union, and to Poland and so on and so forth. And so the years are going by, and Clay still has this material on his hands. It's kind of going slowly, and they're going to start to shut down the military government in 1949. And so you still have material in these collecting points, what to do with them. And the most important body of material were airless Jewish property. Obviously, the idea of returning airless Jewish property to the country of origin is problematic. It's Germany, and that seemed to be obscene. A number of the Eastern European countries were very anti-Semitic. There were pogroms in Poland. So the idea of returning airless Jewish Polish property to Poland didn't seem appropriate. And so the World Jewish Congress and the American Jewish Congress and a variety of organizations constantly were lobbying the American government, the late 1940s, about what to do with this. And one of the concepts they came up with was really the idea of sort of a Jewish international trusteeship for this airless property that could be used for the benefit of the Jewish people. And so in 1949, as they're starting to close down, an organization called Jewish Cultural Reconstruction, JCR, is organized. It's incorporated, actually, in the state of New York. And it's part of a larger umbrella organization called Jewish Restitution Successor Organization, the JRSO, which was dealing primarily with non-cultural property and what to do with that, and reparations for the Jewish people and so forth. And so this material, this airless property that was still in the hands of the American military government, was deeded over to the JCR, and it was the JCR's responsibility to ascertain were there any heirs, in fact, and if not, to work out how to distribute this material. Now, it was approximately 250,000 books, and it is very difficult with books, unless you have complete library collections together, to ascertain who really is the owner of the books. There was some art and a great deal of cultural property, religious property, Torahs and scrolls and ritual items that were used in worship services for communities that no longer, by and large, existed. So, how would they distribute this? And a professor named Salo Barone, a professor from Columbia, was the president of the JCR. He was originally a scholar from Austria and lost most of his family in the Holocaust. But he came over to the United States in the 1920s. And so he and a number of colleagues organized the JCR and developed rules, regulations for how they would distribute the property. The primary idea is that it would be distributed to wherever there were vibrant Jewish communities. And so that was decided. Basically, it would be Israel, the United States, Britain, and South Africa had very active Jewish communities. So most of the property was divided that way. 40-40, kind of 10-10 percentage-wise. And some left for the communities in Europe. And that was very controversial for the communities in Europe who felt they were the heirs to what was left. And the perspective of the JCR was that they were not, they were broken communities, very few people, and really unable to handle and to care for all of this cultural property. And so that's how it was set up. That kind of basic idea of trusteeship really has continued to the current time. There were a variety of problems in the American zone. There was a famous case of the theft by military service personnel, a couple actually, who were in the military, who stole the Hesse crown jewels. That was quite a flap. And the Army congratulated itself on solving that crime and putting these people in prison. But in fact, a lot of cultural material was brought back by GIs. And so there was an effort by the government in the early 50s. They issued the State Department issued a circular to American museums and libraries and art houses and auction houses and so forth, saying, if you have this material, you need to turn it in to us. No questions asked. And there were about, 1,600 or so items that were turned in by 1954, which is really when the effort started. There was a very zealous cultural and fine arts advisor in the State Department, and she just was so interested in this that she really she just kept pushing it. Ardelia Hall. If you come out to do research at College Park, there's an Ardelia Hall collection, of materials that come from her. And so, she was kind of, by this point, the one who was basically interested in it. There were a lot of problems between the Germans, the Italians, and so forth about, cultural stolen property back and forth, and the United States often found itself in the middle of these disputes. But by and large, by the mid-50s, this was pretty much died down. The Soviets returned some material to the East Germans as a propaganda move in the late 1950s, but pretty much there were some court cases in this country in the 1960s that were very interesting. There was one. There was two paintings that a fellow named Eli Elikofan had, and they were considered stolen, and from a Dresden art museum, Dresden Museum, that he said some GI had given to him. He wasn't quite clear on the details of how all that worked. And so, you had a case where the Undersecretary of State tried to get him to return it, and he wouldn't do it. So the basic policy of the U.S. government then and since that point has been, okay, if there are claims about, of a work of art or whatever, we'll just advise everybody to go to the civil courts, get a lawyer, and battle it out. The U.S. government does not intervene in these cases, generally speaking, as an active partner. And so, of course, the civil route is a very expensive and laborious one. In this case, some Grand Duchess of Saxony, Weimar, said it was hers. The Federal Republic of Germany said it was theirs, and the German Democratic Republic said it was theirs. And so, when it was all settled, and Mr. Elikofan said it was his. So when it all got settled, it went to the Federal Republic of Germany. And by this point, the U.S. had recognized the German Democratic Republic, so we really didn't get in the middle of these things. And so the basic route that most people had to file then and since, when you have a claim, is to go through the courts, which is a very expensive and tedious and lengthy process that is difficult for many people to pursue. And so there things sort of settled down. A couple of court cases in the 60s, and that was about it. Once there was the unexpected, at least to most people, unexpected collapse of the Soviet Union and the Eastern European nations, archives started to open up. And you began to find out, and particularly in Russia, you really had access in the early 90s for the first time to what was called the Soviet Secret Archives, since renamed, which indicated, all the archival collections of the Western European governments that the Soviets actually had, because they had taken them from the Germans, who had taken them from the French and the Belgians and the Dutch and so forth. And so that began to become clear. Then there was an article published in Moscow saying that over 10 million books had been taken by the Soviet Trophy Commission, which Stalin set up in 1945. And the Soviet and later Russian position is that Stalin's authorization was adequate legal basis to take the property that was taken. And the idea was to compensate Russia for its grievous losses during the war. And, of course, most of these 10 million books were not necessarily German. I mean, they were partly German, but from a variety of countries. And then, of course, there are many works of art that are in Russian museums. So in the early 90s, there was, under Yeltsin, about a 4-year period where there were a number of agreements actually made by Russia with Germany, with Liechtenstein, with France, with Belgium, and the Netherlands on the return of archives and books and that sort of thing. And as long as these countries were able to kind of pay for the return, really, because the condition of the records, the condition of the economy was so bad that basically what the French did, is that they would buy the microfilm equipment and all the microfilm film stock so that the Russians could microfilm and have a copy and pay for the transportation and all this sort of thing. And so for a couple of years, these archives are starting to come back to Western European countries. And almost all of Liechtenstein, I think Belgium and the Netherlands came back, and about 3/4 of the French archives that were held by the Russians came back. But by 1994, there was a major reaction in Moscow from both the nationalist sector and the communist sector that this restitution was absolutely wrong, the wrong thing to do, and it by and large had strong popular support, this position. So eventually the Duma set up a very, very complicated process that made restitution impossible. And they would never consider returning any of the art that were in the national museums. So that did not happen. And so that's basically kind of where the situation remained from the late 90s to the present. Now, there was a tremendous amount of activity going on in Europe, in the United States, on these issues during the 90s. The 90s were phenomenally active, as active as the 40s. I think you can compare the 40s and the 90s for activity in the restitution arena. And a lot of it was stimulated by the fact that they were trying to develop these civil societies in Eastern Europe. So what happened to church property that had been, confiscated by the Soviet or by the communists and so forth. And the World Jewish Congress and others, began to agitate for a resolution of some very long-standing issues related to dormant Swiss bank accounts, compensation for slave labor, Nazi gold, which you may remember was an issue that kind of blew up in the headlines around 1996. Senator D'Amato, I think, was the chair of the banking committee at that time. And this came to his attention, and they sent researchers actually out to College Park, committee researchers, and they start to dig into this material we have and found out there was a lot of gold that were seized by the Nazis that never was returned, actually. And there was a tripartite gold commission set up after World War II, but it never really completed its work. And so this issue led to a conference in London in 1997, which was the first conference dealing with reparations or restitution since 1946, the Paris Conference of 1946. So a long period of time passed before this issue was back on the diplomatic and political stage. And there they finally made a resolution of the gold issue, and it would go to the Jewish communities and how this would work, closed down the tripartite gold commission at long last. The driving force in the American government for this was Stuart Eizenstat. And I don't think much of what was accomplished, frankly, would have been accomplished without him. And so one of the points I want to make in my presentation is that when you look at it from the 40s to the 90s, a handful of individuals are what drove this. This was not a mass movement. This was not a major initiative of the American government, but there were those who were interested that kind of drove policy and drove action. And Eizenstat was very, very important. He started first with this issue when he was the U.S. ambassador to the European Union and kind of dealing with civil society issues, and kind of started to get into restitution issues in the East European nations. Then President Clinton gave him the task to pull together an interagency group and do a study, basically, obviously, on records from the National Archives by and large, on the Nazi gold issue. Everything had blown up with D'Amato and the committee and a lot of publicity, and so the administration's reaction was to set up this group to kind of study this, find out what happened, make recommendations. It led to the London conference. At the London conference, Eizenstat pushed it further and said there really needed to be a conference that dealt with art, cultural property. We've got to deal with dormant bank accounts, slave labor claims. All of this really needs resolution as a moral imperative. And so there was a Washington conference held in 1998, December of 98, and focused primarily on art and cultural property. And it was very contentious, really. And it was questionable whether various nations would actually send delegations, because the Germans said the Russians had better not say anything about wanting more reparations. And the Russians said the Germans, owe us. And so somehow he finessed all of this, and the conference met and came up with 11 principles that were really based on the work of the American Association of Museums, which had started to respond to a lot of criticism about the possibility that American museums had stolen art on its walls. And not necessarily that the museums had gone out to try to buy stolen art, but for those familiar with the art world, the questions of provenance and all that sort of thing up until very recent times was a very hazy sort of thing. It was basically kind of a handshake sort of deal. And so these museum directors got together and came up with a set of principles that Eizenstat and his team massaged and presented to the Washington Conference, which if I can remember right, had maybe 35 or 40 nations attending. And the basic emphasis was not on coercion. This effort had to be basically voluntary if it was going to work. There was really no mechanism to compel anybody. So it's got several emphases, these principles. One is to do more research in the area of provenance and ascertain with good research, what came from where. There needed to be a mechanism using the internet that could get this information out to many people, heirs and survivors and heirs of the Holocaust, and others. And then we needed to come up with like a mediation service, because clearly, the court route in the United States is really not viable by and large, and lengthy. We have elderly survivors and heirs. You needed to have some kind of remedy of this. And I guess the idea was, as kind of one example of how this might work, Daniel Searle, who is a pharmaceutical company heir, gave a Degas painting to the Chicago Institute of Art that he had certainly bought in good faith and gave to the museum, but in fact it was claimed by the heirs of a couple who died in the Holocaust as belonging to them, and eventually got clear it did belong to them. And so the solution that they came up with before going to court was that each side would hold title to half. Searle would pay the heirs for their part and then donate to the Chicago Institute of Art the material, the paintings. And so this was the idea that Eizenstat had, that you work out, some mediation and compromises to kind of get these issues settled as much as can. And I would just note that he worked and resolved the Swiss bank issue, dormant bank accounts. There was an agreement he reached there, and on slave labor compensation. So this takes us really to 2001, and basically very little has happened on the part of the American government since then. Our focus has been elsewhere, domestic security, war and terror, whatever. And so there's been no push, in the government since then. So I would simply close by saying that it seems to me that the government should, as a moral issue, continue interest in this. There is an office in the State Department filled by a Foreign Service officer, but I think there needs to be a prominent person, an Eizenstat or somebody at that level, that can bring together the Russians, the European Union, the United States, the World Jewish Congress, and try to put these principles that were developed in the Washington Conference into effect. So that's it. I've said enough, and let's stop right now. And thank you for your attention, and would love to open this up for conversation.
Thank you very much for that really fascinating presentation. There's so much in there that I'm sure we'll have quite a variety of questions. I'll open the floor. Please wait for the microphone, and please identify yourself before you ask your question. Wait just a minute. Here comes the mic.
Once again, thank you very much. It was so good that perhaps one doesn't have to read the book. But in fact,
The book's even better.
we will.
Yeah, do read the book.
We will. One thing which you sort of touched on, but I wanted to ask you about, is a different form of looting. And that is the looting of art materials, let's say, during or after World War II, after they came into the hands of the Allied governments, but were sitting in either return to countries, let's say, or conceivably sitting in a place like the Munich collection point. And individual soldiers had access to them. How much of that went on, as best as you can tell?
Well, there's a very interesting case that I think responds to your point that indicates some of it was quite serious. You might remember back in the papers, 10 or 15 years ago, a case about some treasures taken from a German church in 1945 from Quedlinburg. Well, that was taken by an American GI, Joe Tom Meter, from Dallas, Texas. And the way this kind of came to people's attention was after he died in 1980 from cancer, his brother and sister wanted to sell it. You know, they wanted to make some money. And these were ancient, like 11th century gospels and reliquaries. I mean, we're not talking, a German Luger kind of thing, as a trophy. And so they try to start to sell this, and obviously those they approach kind of go, whoa, this isn't your average, kind of sale. And so they contact the Germans. This all began prior to the fall of the Berlin Wall and the unification of Germany. So this church is in East Germany at that time. And so a researcher was employed by a foundation from Germany, Willy Corte, who does a lot of research at the National Archives. He worked with a New York Times reporter, Bill Honan, I think was his name, and a local lawyer here, a D.C. lawyer, Thomas Klein, who gets involved in a lot of these cases and so forth. And so kind of they dug into this matter and confronted the Meters and went to court, because the Meters were starting to sell some of it, to get an injunction to stop it. And so these heirs got about $3 million, which they agreed to turn over the rest of what they had to the German foundation, and consider the money they received as a finder's fee. And then the federal, what got Al Capone? The IRS. And so the IRS steps in, from a tax perspective, and starts, chasing these folks around. And so that's just an example of and there were valuable postal stamps taken by an Army captain, and it's a significant level. How significant, how widespread is really hard to tell. That was the purpose of Ardelia Hall's circular, was to try to kind of flush this stuff out. There is something called the National Stolen Property Act in the United States, which, if you've stolen something over $5,000, worth more than $5,000, it can be cross international lines or state lines. You can be prosecuted as a federal offense, and that's been used to some extent. And you can't, you cannot. Stolen property does not transmit under U.S. law. You cannot get a good deed to stolen property. It isn't possible to do that.
Don Wolfensberger with the Wilson Center. We hear a lot about some of the Nazi hierarchy escaping before the end of the war to South America. Is there any indication that any of these treasures were taken with them, and was anything done to recover, if so?
No, there really isn't any indication they were able to take, a lot of treasures with them. I mean, they had to probably travel light, and, this is, by and large, pretty bulky material. An interesting thing, though, about Latin America and a number of other countries, as all of this started to break again in the 1990s,
Yes, go ahead.
Lois Lockyer. I have a general question on records, birth records, property records, this kind of thing. Are we worried about them being destroyed or invalidated or whatever?
In Europe, as a result of this?
Worldwide.
Well, I'm probably not able to speak worldwide, but let me kind of speak to my topic. One of the interesting things about the Nazis is they kept superb records, and they preserved records. And so, what wasn't destroyed in the course of the attacks and the bombing and so on and so forth survived. So we have complete records, in many cases, of the concentration camp inmates. We have records, they've collected records of the Jewish communities that they destroyed for future studies that they were going to do. And so a tremendous amount of archival material, records, birth records, community records, if you will, actually survived the war. And a lot of that ended up going to Israel, as part of this whole, because there were really very few Jewish communities left to inherit any of this. And so a great deal of that material went to Israel for preservation and for access. So it's fascinating. I mean, the meticulous record keeping of the Nazis. That's how we have all these property cards. I mean, they had records in what they took, where they took it from, if it was valuable. You have a little kind of a provenance on it. And these are the property records, property cards I referred to that are at the National Archives in College Park. And so so then you find out that some of the good Nazi records were actually taken by the Russians and never revealed until the 1990s. So now we have access to the complete records of the Nazi looting organization, the Rosenberg organization, because the Russians had part of it and kept that a secret. So there's been more destroyed than was preserved. I think we ought to be clear about that. But a great deal, there was a museum that the Nazis created in Prague that was to commemorate the exterminated race. And they had brought in all kinds of community records and property and so forth from Jewish communities around Czechoslovakia. And so there it was at the end of the war. And so then the question became, what do you do with this? These communities don't exist anymore.
I'm Mary Augusta Thomas from Smithsonian Libraries.
Hi.
Hi, Michael. I'm interested in what's happened with things that weren't repatriated. There must still be a body of material that's out there in government hands, presumably.
That's another issue that was really roiled the 90s and the Washington Conference. Hector Feliciano, a journalist, came out with a book, I think in '95, called The Lost Museum, where he said there were 2,000 Jewish or looted paintings on the walls of French museums. And so Eizenstat wanted Hector to make a statement at the London conference, because he was trying to whip up interest and support, for a Washington conference on art. And the French were very, very upset. Likewise with the Austrians. There's a lot of property that ended up in Austrian museums that were actually looted. And so since the late 90s, The Austrians have returned, I want to say 2,400 items to families, heirs, successor organizations, that sort of thing. I'm not so clear what the French have done. I'm really not, whether they've done much of anything. The Austrians, I think, have been more active. So there's a question. I mean, there's questions about what's on the wall of American museums. And American museums have gone through, I think, a fairly extraordinary effort trying to document, everything they acquired between 1933 and 1945 as to where it came from, who were the owners, all that sort of thing. A lot of, this kind of provenance research is extremely labor intensive. Not every place is the National Gallery of Art that has a staff to do it. Matter of fact, most don't. But there is a lot of pressure for them to do that.
That's the Holocaust era.
Yes. Yes, that Nancy Yeide and others put together at the National Gallery, which is a wonderful tool for people doing provenance research. By the way, just make a plug before I get to this question. The day after the Washington Conference, the National Archives out of College Park had a day of research where we would teach people how to do research and all the records we have that are relevant Holocaust-era assets. And I would say we had 200 to 300 people. It was amazing. It was amazing. Yes, sir.
My name is Wolfgang Renzi. I'm from the Austrian Embassy. I wanted to ask you, what is your experience with databases of looted art? Because I think one of the most interesting projects and one of the most successful projects is that there has been established now a database which is in the internet since 16th of October of 2006, with the great number of pieces of art where the origin is not very clear, and for heirs and for potential heirs, it would be interesting, I think, to see into this database. What is your experience with databases in general of looted art and of art which the origin of which is not very clear?
Right. I think your point on the database is very important. It's one of the main principles from the Washington Conference was to create a database. I think now, as best I can figure out, there are about 4 different, maybe now with what you've said, 5 different databases that can be used in art looting research. So there's really nothing that's complete. And when I mentioned earlier that I thought there needed to be kind of an international forum, it would be that this forum could put together, based on what now exists and so forth, a consolidated database that would be, people could access and make it easier to research. Some of these other databases I think now are really fee-based. In other words, you pay a fee, see what kind of material's in there. So I think we would want something that is interactive, interoperable, it's free, and so therefore it would need institutional support. And that's what I meant, with the United States, the World Jewish Congress, the European Union, or the Council of Europe, and just sort of, put, the resources together. So obviously, you can create databases. I mean, that's pretty easy to do. But thinking through, what are the fields? How is the research going to be done? That sort of thing. There's the research part of it is more difficult, really, I think, than the database part. Who's going to do all of this research? Because it's scattered everywhere. A lot of different places. The National Archives is one place, places in Europe, different places in this country. And so this would be a very long-term effort. I think it's more to kind of right historical wrongs. I think we're moving past the time, certainly when survivors are still with us by and large, and there still are heirs. But you're trying to correct the historical record. I think needs to be one of the part of the impetus for doing this.
Yes. Back here.
Put your hand to.
You talked about the fact that in the United States you can't transfer stolen art,
Right.
which is
Transfer a good title. Can't
transfer a good title to it. But the big stumbling block here is not the United States. At least I don't think so. But Europe, where the transfer of art does not necessarily require a good title. Good faith is sufficient, and
Yes.
that is blocking the return of some art objects we know about, and probably a whole lot others that we don't know about.
I mean, that's why I talk about the international forum and a mediation approach. I mean, a legalistic approach of trying to fight things out in the courts. Very expensive, very lengthy, unpredictable results. And the interesting issue in the United States is the statute of limitations. They vary amongst the 50 states. And if you want to file a case, you want to file it in New York. It has the most favorable statute of limitations. You have 3 years from the time, if you're the one who has lost the work, 3 years from the time you're informed, to file a case. And not 3 years from, when it was taken. Obviously, that's long ago. And so you'll find most of the court cases that are described are fought out in courts in New York because of the statute of limitations. There was some effort a few years back to change that, and I think that effort in the New York legislature failed to change the statute of limitations. I think it did. Yes, a question here.
John Harris, Department of Commerce. What happens after the next major war? Are we going to have the same mess? Or is there any suggestions to cut down on this problem?
Well, we certainly saw a mess in Iraq with cultural property. So I think to answer your question from the point of view of international law, there was a 1954 Geneva Convention dealing with protecting cultural property. And it provided for, there were supposed to be refuges in various countries that would be protected. The Soviet Union, the United States, and Great Britain did not sign because they felt that with the possibility of nuclear bombing or conventional bombing, they could not guarantee the safety of any of these sites. So we are not a signatory to that. There were 2 UNESCO conventions, 1970 and 72, that got mixed support. But there really isn't much beyond, really, I think, the Geneva Conventions of a century ago. They're on the books of international law that we adhere to. And so I'd say the same problems are likely, to occur and reoccur. There's really no international focus on this issue.
Thank you very much for a magnificent presentation. Really very clear. It's a very complex subject. Let me ask one question of my own to conclude. I was talking to you about it before we began, but there's another sort of side of this question that I had some personal experience with, which is, what happens when an effort is made to determine the provenance of a work of art and it's unsuccessful. Is there, what happened in my case was that we had some paintings that were that were purchased by my husband's great aunt, who was the wife of his great uncle, who had been Czechoslovakia's ambassador to Berlin in the late 30s. And she bought a lot of art when she was in Berlin. And we had a number of pieces of it and wanted to sell 2 paintings that we didn't particularly like but thought they might be valuable. Took them to Sotheby's, and Sotheby's determined the painter, being a late Renaissance Dutch painter, and did their research to find where they were sold at a particular auction house in Berlin, and found the date of it. But the only thing given for the person who sold it was initials, right? And so then the trail was cold. There was nowhere to go beyond that point. Well, we got that far, and there was nothing to do beyond the initials. But this was in the late 90s or early 2000s, actually. Maybe it was more like 2001, 2002. And by that time, the issue, having been surfaced in the 90s, was keen enough that Sotheby's was nervous about it and simply said, well, the standard has become higher. It used to be you had to make a good faith effort to establish provenance. Now, you have to actually establish it. You have to go beyond a good faith effort. And so if you can't establish provenance, too bad. It stays in the closet, which is where these paintings stayed. And so that was it was a little bit frustrating. And I'm wondering if you have any perspective on that. Is there a kind of awareness that some mechanism needs to be created for kind of, I don't know, doing what, I don't know, but putting some sort of clearance on things that for which provenance simply can't be established?
I mean, I think it's almost in many cases an insoluble problem. I mean, I hate to kind of end on a bit of a down note. It is not very difficult to ascertain if something comes from a state or public museum or collection, or if it's kind of a Rothschild collection, where they're very, very, very prominent. But where since the Nazi looting effort, and I think this is what we're talking about from the 1930s in Germany, it was expropriated.
Right.
It could have come from anybody.
Right.
There is no record of where it was taken, when it was taken. You would have to go through extraordinary research to try to track, who had it in Germany, and it would just take an enormous amount of effort. So, a lot of things that were stolen by neighbors, for instance. There's just a lot of stuff that's never coming.
Yeah.
It was when it was taken, it was gone, and that's it. And I'm afraid this kind of falls into that kind of case.
May I add something to that?
Please.
Both Sotheby's and Christie's have established a position of vice president in charge of restitution, and they're both being much more cautious, put it that way, before they put something for auction. And part of that is actually quite mercenary in the sense that they're trying to develop a market for more auction of art that was reclaimed, so to speak, and then is put up for auction by the heirs or the survivors. So that's quite active. The other comment I just wanted to make, you probably know this, but when I was at the Hermitage about 2 years ago, there was a major exhibit of art which had fallen into the hands of the Russians, and which, I forget exactly what they call it, but it was sort of restitution to Russia for what Russia had lost. And they were proudly exhibiting it, and even to the point where there were photographs of homes in Berlin in particular showing the art as it had been on the walls in the 1920s and perhaps 1930s. And now here we have the art in Moscow. So that's
well, I'll close with one comment on this particular issue. At the Bard conference in 1995, I was asked to give a paper on whether the Allied Control Council, which was Allied in Germany, authorized the Russians to take German property. I read every sheet of paper that we have at the National Archives, official records, for 4 years. There was never a meeting on it. There was never a vote on it. It didn't happen. And so that's basically what my paper was all about, to refute a Russian position. And so basically what they fall back on, as I said earlier, was the Stalin authorization from the Soviet Trophy Commission that this is legal. And so they would have no problem at all with exhibiting exactly what you described. From their perspective, it's legal, It's ours. It's owed to us, whether it's actually German or not. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Where's the book for sale in Washington? Do you know?
Yes, at the National Archives bookstore.
Okay.
In fact, I'm supposed to give a lecture there tomorrow at noon, and they're going to have copies for sale.
Excellent.
Discounted, too. And this book, the price needs to be discounted.
What's the
Yeah.
price?
The price from Cambridge is $70, but it'll be discounted at $56. I know.